In the story creation ecosystem, worlds are created by two separate, yet equally important groups. The worldbuilders, who envision the world and its intricacies, and the storytellers, who bring their world to life. This is their podcast. In 2019, a crack world-building unit was sent to prison by a critics court for an inconsistency they didn't commit. These men promptly escaped from a maximum security blog page to an underground Discord server. Today, still wanted by the critics, they survive as builders of fortune. If you have a problem, if no one else can help, and if you can find them, maybe you can hire the WB team.
Hello and welcome everyone again. And I would usually ask if any of you guys have some questions for today, but I think we started the conversation kind of already before I started recording, and that's about rules and when we need them. I don't know if you, Daniel, want to get us back into the conversation, or if there's anything you think is left to say there.
Well, maybe. It really depends on the topic. In that specific circumstance, it was actually about dynamics, and the reason why I said don't create rules before you actually need them is because we had that negative example where a group I extremely complex hierarchy but barely any members, and instead of just giving it up and giving up their rules and just saying, okay, fine, we'll just redo it, they were clinging on to it. So basically 3/4 of their member base were ministers. It was just pretty silly. That was pretty much all.
So basically
But it sounds like an
bureaucracy.
extended hierarchy. Like bureaucracy.
Can you get a bit
Oh
closer
yeah,
to
I mean,
your
hey,
mic?
if you are into bureaucracy, like if you're into that, but I mean, bureaucracy really.
Okay. I just thought there would be a bit more that you wanted to add to that, because I kind of got out of that part of the conversation. Calm, anything you want to add to that, or?
Not really, other than the fact that bureaucracy is the most horrible word in the English language to spell.
True.
That is actually false.
And what is the worst word then, Job?
I mean,
I don't even remember how it goes, but it's the word that, like, it's the name for the fear of palindromes, if I remember correctly.
Wasn't it
Oh, the
also
fear
a
of palindrome. Yeah, it's it's ibophobia.
Hyperphobic. Okay, but that itself is not a palindrome then, right?
Yes, it is. It's phobia spelt backwards and then phobia.
Oh, okay.
So ibophobia.
just to be extra mean.
Yeah, which cruel bastard thought of that one?
Probably the same one who thought of hippopotamonstrous esquidaliophobia.
What?
That's the fear of long words.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I guess they do that on purpose then.
And the fear of lots of small holes together has a lot of small holes together in it.
Okay.
I'm just going to look up what that was.
So, Daniel, Job, do you have any questions you want to ask for today's session? If not, I have plenty of questions, so just wanted to ask beforehand.
I don't particularly have that many right now. Like, I'm trying to go over one of the things I'm world building, so I might end up, like, basically throughout the session figuring out that, wait, I should probably ask about something, but right now I can't think of anything.
Yeah, that's fair enough. Daniel, anything on your end?
Not right now. Just for first time, want to listen in a bit and get the grips.
Mm-hmm. All right. Carbon, did you find the word that you were looking for, or should we?
Yeah, it was trypophobia, is the fear of closely packed holes. And the word itself has closely packed holes in it.
The whole thing is a lot more interesting than it sounds because, like, it's technically not a phobia and there's a lot of weirdness with it.
Yep, I've also heard that it's not really a phobia and more of a just a
General disgust.
normal response really. Like all those
Yeah.
images associated with trypophobia, you can also easily associate them with disease, for example. Or like one of the worst examples I've seen is that toad that hatches its younglings in its skin pouches on the back, and they just
Oh yeah, that one.
Oh,
yeah,
that falls under that category.
Yeah, once the eggs are
But
hatched, yeah.
it's not
Oh, okay.
and just more the viscera crawling under your skin. Like other things are triggered. It itself isn't really a phobia.
I guess it
Yeah,
kind
like,
of boils down to
people
whether.
do have. Go ahead.
Yeah, I would say it kind of boils down to me at least, like whether you would classify disgust under like fear, if you see that as a subcategory or something different.
Like, the weird thing about it is that, like, it technically, like, the people that actually get, like, a proper phobia from it, it's usually, like, very similar to, like, windmill sickness or wind turbine sickness, or however you want to call it, in that it's usually because they heard that it exists and they started exhibiting the symptoms. But people that actually haven't heard that it exists, like, it has become like a major pop culture thing, the trypophobia thing. People that haven't heard that it exists, they will say, yeah, it's a bit disgusting, but they won't actually have a phobic reaction to it, which is weird.
So kind of like similar to spiders, because I've heard that a lot of people who either have like arachnophobia or just general disgust towards spiders probably wouldn't have that if they would have been socialized differently.
I mean, in my case, I also have a lot of dramatic stories about spiders, so it might not be true there, but yeah.
In my case, spiders in my country will kill you.
Yeah, I would say
So
Australia is
being
probably the
afraid
one
of them is a
place.
good idea.
Yeah.
Didn't you have like an episode of a weird kid show banned
Peppa
because
Pig,
it
yeah.
literally had the message spiders are tiny creatures that can't hurt you?
Yeah, there was an episode of Peppa Pig that was banned in Australia.
Because it was basically false information or what? Or at least for
Yeah,
Australia.
because Peppa Pig is British, and England doesn't have any, or at least it has very, very few venomous spiders, whereas almost every spider in Australia is venomous. So when they sent that over to Australia, the censors just went, no, you can't have that.
I don't think there's a lot of
Because-
venomous spiders in Europe generally.
Even here, I think we only have one proper venomous spider. The rest can be annoying at times, but like you only have one.
Hmm.
And it's not even that dangerous. I mean, it's dangerous, but honestly, like, it's one of those things where if you get stung by it, you kind of deserve it.
I guess that some biologists would argue that's basically every animal.
No, but like with this one, you really have to try.
Okay.
Will it intentionally avoid biting you because it's going, well, you're too big, you're not prey. I don't want to bite you.
It's not just that. You also, like, it's also very rare, and like, you usually won't find it on accident.
So you have to specifically be searching for it, and then you have to reach out and touch it.
And probably also piss it off on the way, because, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Gotta say, I'm really proud of us. We already are done with the first tangent and haven't even started with any of the topics yet. It's gonna be a big
Record
podcast.
speed.
Alright, so to go to the first topic that I was thinking about, and I'm gonna pick one of the more generic ones, is a topic which probably a lot of people kind of like to read or write about, but probably don't want to be in, and that's war. So, to be a bit more specific, what do you guys think are usual justifications for people to go to war with each other? And I don't want to put this on the like moral category, what do you think is justified to go to war over, but like historically, what people used as justifications to go to war.
I would argue that in fiction, it's usually very much like you have way too many reasoning for wars. Like, way too many reasons. Like, it sounds stupid, I know, but bear with me. Europe had a war over a bucket.
What?
Like, between two villages that were very, very heavily armed over a bucket.
Okay,
People
but that's two villages,
way
right?
too much justification for wars in fiction, especially like in societies that are like more medieval. There are justifications for war where like, you pissed me off, we're gonna fight. Yeah, that was it.
Well, but
In many cases,
isn't that just general violence? And I mean, I would classify war as either two states or two societies going at each other. So I wouldn't classify
they would
this probably
conquer
not the
each
same.
other and had peace treaties and everything. It was far more than just like unorganized people running around with swords. It was a very organized thing between two small towns, even not villages, like over a bucket. And that's just one of the ridiculous examples.
Okay, calm.
Well, I'd like to point out that in Sanskrit, they've got about 20 words for war, but one of their words for war is gavisti. I'm not sure if that's how it's pronounced. It's gavisti or something like that. It quite literally translates as desire for cows.
Okay.
So as in, it's literally a word for war that's saying they're going to war because they want more land and more resources.
All right. Daniel, do you want to say something as well, or?
As far as like the historic context goes, I don't have my head that example of the two villages going over a bucket, that was probably not right after they were best buddies. I would imagine there was already.
Yeah.
They
Especially
probably
since
wanted
both.
a reason to fight each other.
Exactly. So in that case, I mean, again, I don't know that story, but in that case,
it's literally called the War of the Bucket, by the way. Like, you can look it up. It's a thing.
I will. I mean, to go to war, that's a good question. Ideology definitely springs to mind first when I think of it. Wars is also a thing, but I think it's less people think it is. You usually find an alternative to resources. You don't always find an alternative to your neighbor having an ideology that you don't like. Because that's usually only fix with a big club, and then again, you never fix.
So with the War of the Bucket, the actual reason why Bologna declared war on Modena is because Modena took the castle of Monteviglio from Bologna.
And they.
So it's a weird story, and I guess I should clarify it a bit more. But it was to give a point. Basically, like, there is a lot of weirdness like around the whole story. Like, the three things we do know about the story is that a castle was taken near the start, a bucket was stolen, and that the war actually happened.
It did happen, yeah. In 1325.
For many years, and like I mean hundreds of years, like until recently, the belief about this whole thing, because it was a very old story, like how everybody believed that it actually happened was literally around a bucket. Now, granted, with more recent historical developments, like we do know a bit more about potential ulterior motives for it. But the point that this story drives, and I think is a point that is often forgotten, is that for countless years, like we're talking hundreds of years, everybody would hear, "Oh yeah, these two towns went to war over a bucket,"
They weren't
and nobody
towns,
in
by the
Europe
way.
thought it was actually weird or like out of place.
They weren't towns. They were regions in Italy. Two significant regions in Italy.
Yeah. Then that just makes it even worse. But like the point is, the story was passed for hundreds of years as they went to war over a bucket, and nobody even raised an eyebrow.
Well, yeah, apparently Modena still actually has the bucket as a trophy of war.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. These are levels of like saltiness and spite that I didn't imagine.
I love the fact that Kroz appeared in the moment that I said Modena still has a bucket as a trophy.
Yeah.
Can he speak, by the way, in here, or is
He
not
can, yeah.
listed? Oh, okay.
Of course I can.
So then I guess one thing that Daniel said kind of gets me to the next point for this topic, and that's what's your guys' opinion about the belief that, in quotation mark, all wars are fought over resources and land, and ideology is just the personal justification for basically the foot soldier on the ground.
I'd say that all wars have some kind of economic bearing. Whether that's the actual reason, that's probably debatable, I'd say. But
Yeah,
I mean,
would say
like,
that there is some
you can-
economic. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'd agree with that because there's definitely arguments to be made that going back and forth over like the Crusades. Some people say it's economic, some people say it's ideological, and there's others that say it's because the Turks came in and took over Jerusalem and it wasn't safe, so they had to go make it safe. And there's all sorts of arguments over war, but I think, I don't know that I agree that all war is based off of resources.
Yeah, as a counterpoint to that, I would also like to quote some Roman senator whose name I forgot, and I think the quote goes something like, wars being financed through bottomless treasure chests or something like that. I'm paraphrasing, but so...
Yeah.
I mean, you can see a change in how wars are fought, and especially in the last century. I would definitely agree with that wars usually have a motive other than we just don't like you as a neighbor. I would probably narrow down not even economics and just power. When you look into like the whole East-West conflict, that was oftentimes not necessarily about tangible resources. It was about some extent, but it was also about power and projection of power. If you have power, if you have might, you can out the better deal for yourself. So that's what motivated a lot of wars, or rather, but maybe conflict century. Now, of course, you will still wars where there is just, we don't like you, or the answer is more stuff. But as a drop down, it's more about projection.
Okay.
Although World War II was definitely economic.
Yeah,
partially.
That would have been my
It
question.
was also ideological.
It was
Legit.
ideologically driven, yes, but the fact is, it was one of the very decisive factors in causing the war was the fact that Europe was forcing Germany to pay back billions and billions of dollars in debt, or probably millions back then.
That's thing you could explore if that war would have happened without the Treaty of Versailles.
Yeah.
Some would say that the Weimar Republic would have actually died sooner without the common enemy. Germany was not ready to become democratic at that. The Second World War was so atrocious that everybody, well, minus Russia, had. I mean, it is, isn't it? But everybody was more or less forced to see reason, lesser of many evils, and well, Germany, as a relatively young state, has been doing quite decently. Bring anyone. So I'm not sure. Would that, of course, it would change history, absolutely, dramatically so. But I say the war wouldn't have happened without the Treaty of Versailles. I'm not sure.
I would argue that it would have been less likely to happen. But I mean,
Especially in the,
Maybe
like, in the way it did.
yeah.
Like that.
I mean, it could have been Russia or like the Soviet Union who would have been the aggressor, maybe.
Italy. I think Italy would probably be a pretty good candidate for an aggressor.
I mean, Italy started in the First World War. They were they were on the side of the Allies. So the whole.
I mean, Italy were on the side of the Allies in World War II as well for about 5 minutes every
Wow.
10
Yeah,
minutes.
and then what was that?
That's a very complex story. The Italy, the whole fascism thing happened after World War One. There was during the war, there were always elements remaining in Italy that were against fascism, and they seized the moment in the Second World War. Now, could you say that it was also because they were losing it? I mean, yeah, the governing party, so rebels, quote unquote, can pick up stuff, but it's not like one leader went from we're winning to oh shit, let's switch sides. No, they hanged. So leaders changed.
I guess would be kind of similar compared to what would have happened if Hitler got assassinated. Could have also changed the
Which
war.
one of
dynamic.
the million?
Yeah, I mean there were many attempts, but like in general, I guess it's probably better to get.
Shit. There was a.
Hmm?
Oh yeah, there was another point I wanted to make. I find it always rather like the Treaty of Versailles was in terms of impact German behavior, but also French behavior, for example, was fascinating in the sense that it also has driven the of Nazi Germany extremely, because many things were not allowed, could not be done in the open. So there was a big incentive in developing newer technologies, lighter planes, because Nazi Germany or Weimar Germany was not heavy planes that could be used for bombing. That was actually one of, or I'm not 100% calculate, that was one of the driving factors for the development. Blimps, no, not blimps, they died out. Unmotorized planes, sailing, what's the word I'm looking for?
Oh yeah, I know what you mean. Planes without like an engine, like gliders, I guess.
Yeah, gliders, thank you. Intensively by Nazi Germany during the wars, also for cargo transportation. and they were developed. New manufacturing techniques were developed because of the Treaty of Versailles. So that, yeah.
And also Hitler founded Volkswagen.
True, which is still a bane to this day. So, if we're already on the topic of the Second World War, one question that would probably fit in nicely here would be, what does it take for people to support a war? And I guess we could also, like, split this into different categories. What does it take to initially support it? And then what does it take to keep on fighting? And then when does it break?
The UK would be a pretty good example for what a positive example is for keep on fighting, because attempted blockade, at least, UK was actually quite in danger of just getting UK. I mean the island of England.
No, England's one country out of three.
Great Britain. Sorry, there we go. Great Britain. Now I word. So they actually had to incentivize and motivate their population to grow as much food as they could. So that what it's like a really famous thing where the British army Nazis pushing in Belgium, and last minute ships picked them up and got them out safely.
Are you talking about Dunkirk or?
I think it was Dunkirk, but I think that might have.
Yeah, it was Dunkirk.
But that was ships. Now, of course, they were kind of motivated. But still,
it's like you do need like quite a bit to justify a war for the top echelons of like a country, because like wars are expensive, and like I think you've seen this more and more. Like, you see this more and more like as time goes on, how like in the past wars could be initiated over the stupidest, smallest things. But as we move forward, like more and more in time, countries are a lot more formidable in war. So suddenly, like there's a lot more of a reason not to engage in pointless wars, and so you need a much better reason to even start one, because the damages are usually a lot more extreme. I mean, in the past, some wars would even be over with a duel. So, like, and you see, I think nuclear weapons are probably, like, the biggest example of this, like, the biggest, most famous example.
Nuclear deterrent, yeah.
With nuclear weapons, you have such a good reason not to start a huge war that, well, we haven't really had a huge one since between two nuclear countries.
Oh, look,
we've had many close calls, but nobody will actually be bold enough to press the trigger.
Yeah,
So,
we have the capacity to unleash the sun. Let's not do that.
That's just my 2 cents on that.
So I guess we could like generalize, the bigger the capacity for devastation becomes, the less inclined the upper echelon gets to start a war. Does that sound about right?
Echelon would be the actual pronunciation.
As long as they are not as long as they're not driving themselves to the ground, you can have that case of an upper echelon. But then again, they might also just get usurped before the war even starts. So, generally speaking, they have no interest in actually starting a proper war. But nothing stops them from having a lot of very close calls, especially if they need a bit more pressure, like politically. Then they can easily do that, because, like, what, are you going to replace the ruler during a war?
Okay, so I guess posturing becomes a bit more important in this regard then.
Espionage becomes important as well.
And, like, again, generally, I forgot the proper term for it, but it was, like, this really famous term for, like, why the US and Russia didn't actually have like almost any proper confrontation in the Cold War. Was like the whole
Mutually
mutual
assured
destruction
destruction?
thing.
Mm-hmm.
I think that might actually be the term. Like,
Yeah, it's
because
mutually assured
they both
destruction.
had so many nuclear missiles aimed at each other that, like, the smallest confrontation would result in both basically getting destroyed. And in fact,
Mutually-
Russia took it a step further, because if I remember correctly, recently they had tested a weapon that is so potent that if they fire it into the sea or something, it will basically devastate all life on Earth after a certain amount of time, because it will just cause so much harm to the ocean. And I remember they tested it. I forgot when, but when they were asked why the hell are you doing this, it was basically, well, if Russia doesn't get to exist, why should anybody else?
Are you talking about the Tsar
Um,
bomber?
I could be like misremembering parts of it, but that was like the general gist, and that is the best thing like against the war, just assuring so much destruction to anybody that even tries it that nobody will.
The Tsar bomber was the embodiment of a bygone era. It was a two-stage nuclear device, so you needed a nuke to light the nuke. It was a hydrogen bomb.
Yeah.
And they basically obliterated an island. There was a military town, which was like more of a bunker complex that was 37 miles away. The reverberation of the shockwave of the bomb was what you could, like, the sixth time it surrounded the Earth, it could still be measured. It was just the ultimate unnecessary flex of power, and it was so ridiculous that it was never used, obviously, in testing too, and it was just so highly impractical. It just incredibly impractical.
Militarily, it was almost useless, I think.
Yeah,
It was too
and
heavy as well.
in true Soviet fashion, they had a theoretical stronger version planned, but where they're like, okay, this is just, yeah, we're gonna start cracking the continents with the next one. Let's not.
I'd like to point out for everyone's benefit, I'd like to point out that a uranium bomb is a fission reaction, while a hydrogen bomb is a fusion reaction.
Yeah,
so
but usually fired. Yeah, usually fired by a fission reaction, though. Otherwise, you're not getting the power.
Yeah, because fusion reactions, you can't actually have a chain reaction. So you need something to maintain the heat to allow it to occur.
Yeah, because fusion is so hard to already get that as soon as you get a chain reaction, it already becomes extremely unstable. And the one thing that fusion requires to work is stability.
It's not entirely true. Fusion can be self-sustaining. It's called the sun.
Yeah, but that's not a chain reaction, though. That's caused by the energy produced by the gravitational force pulling all the particles together. That's what the heat is in that instance.
That really depends on what you see as a chain reaction. If you're talking about nuclear decay, then yes, it's you don't have nuclear other particles splitting them. In the case, you have exactly the opposite. So you're using energy, pure energy, so photons in all wavelengths. Although I think for fusion, it's usually a very specific one. And yeah, it's the reaction of the solar pressure and the gravity in the sun, and it's a fascinating subject. Yeah,
the hydrostatic equilibrium.
Why does a giant? Well, when the equilibrium isn't met anymore.
I just want to point out that I find it funny that there's a stage to the Tsar bomber that even the Soviet Union said that's too much for us.
Funny that even they said, yeah, this is overkill.
Yeah.
I mean, there's
This must
there's-
be no whole other level of overkill.
a chemical compound so energetic that not even Nazi Germany wanted to use it. They were experimenting with it as replacement for napalm. And it was just so difficult to handle and so potent. They were like, yeah, no, too dangerous.
Is this thermite?
No, thermite is... Yeah, thermite can be spooky, but it's relatively tame compared to that. It's forgetting the name. Scott Manley made a video on it that was where he went into depths about rocket fuels and in the more ridiculous examples. It's a fluorine compound, chlorfluorine,
Oh, it's a chlorofluorocarbon. Okay.
Yeah. And the only way to contain it was in a stainless steel cylinder with a fluorine coating, and tiniest scratch steel catches on fire. It was so energetic that it would ignite asbestos.
Okay, that is very energetic.
What do you usually need to ignite asbestos?
A lot.
Asbestos, yeah, a lot.
Okay.
Reason
SI measurement a
till
lot.
there's a reason why it was so popular before we discovered that it literally kills people.
I would assume it kills people even more when it's on fire.
Oh yeah. Oh, that smoke must be fantastic. Ooh.
I mean, the biggest problem with asbestos is not, from what my understanding was, it was more when they were removing it or doing construction work with it, rather than it sitting latent in the building.
Asbestos is still used, and this where it's where they have a special permit because it is a really, really good insulator. It just is. It is a really good fire material.
Isn't it also used
Yeah.
in rocket technology? Or am I making stuff up here?
That I don't know what you would use.
It sounds like you could
That's
use
what
it for
astronaut
something.
ice cream is, guys. Astronaut ice cream is just asbestos.
I don't know if asbestos is particularly light mechanical properties that fit. So I don't know if it's used in any rocketry.
I guess carbon.
Yeah, it was used in, according to a NASA report that I just found, it was used in NASA re-entry rockets until 2000.
Oh,
after 2000, it hasn't been used anymore.
But that's
that makes
that's more
a
recent
lot
than
of sense.
Yeah, it's more recent than I anticipated, actually.
It
So,
does
yeah.
re-entry vehicles because they're basically a death trap anyways. With the Crew Dragon carries around a lot of forgot the name, but yeah, extremely toxic chem.
Yeah, like, you're already gonna die probably, so might as well throw in a few more cancerous things. I mean, if you survive, be thankful. Don't worry about the cancer.
But that's it's only dangerous if it comes to contact, and I think it's actually the particulates that it's like mechanically extremely abrasive and fine that it will basically like. I think that's actually one of the issues with the moon dust. It's very similar. It's like just tiny shards of glass that will actually just rip apart your lung. I'm not sure
Well,
if
yeah, moon dust is basalt usually.
yeah, but extremely fine powder, and it's like
Yeah.
it clings to everything. It's nasty. You don't want to breathe it. I think asbestos has a chemical, like a poisoning compound to it. I don't remember quite.
So basically, as soon as you try to leave Earth, everything wants to kill you.
I mean, even before that, especially if you try from Australia, but yeah.
True.
But you're kind of like cheating the system. Like the rocket equation is extremely harsh and not very nice to you. So you kind of need to pull every trick you have to get into orbit and to get into orbit at a price that you can afford.
I mean, you can always just send a dog first to see if it works.
Or multiple.
Or
Or
canary.
frogs, spiders, mice, apes.
Monkeys.
Yup.
I mean,
Alpha Zoo.
NASA even sent a bedbug, in there. I mean, they had one in the computers for one of the rockets, and
We should send a car and see if it gets cancer up there, you know.
pretty sure it was already tested.
Also, do we want to dispel the kind of myth as to NASA is over-engineering stuff when they could just use pencils or something like that? Yeah,
that's
who wants to explain it?
the whole pencil thing or what?
Mm-hmm.
Like, okay, so the joke goes, NASA developed this space grade pen that works, is like pressure fed and works in a vacuum for $2 million. And then the joke goes, but the Soviets just, it's a funny joke, but it's also stupid because the Soviets also ended up using those pressure fed pens, because what does a pencil contain?
What's it called? Graphene or graphite?
Graphite.
Graphite.
The trick
Graphite,
question, extremely active, and it is abrasive, so you will get pen dusting everywhere, and you do not want airborne conductive materials in a spaceship. You really don't.
So interestingly, graphene, which is the little one-dimensional sheets that graphite is made of, is actually harder than diamond in one specific dimension.
Yep, it's extremely. It's. I need to think about the translation.
Sturdy?
Isotropy.
Oh.
It's anisotropic, anti-isotropic.
Anisotropic, yeah.
Yeah, anisotropic, which makes it very useful for actually everywhere, but like concentrating it is the really difficult part.
I do remember that there's a lot of people I know and D&D and other similar hobbies in this country. It's apparently a running inside joke about one day hoping to make a sword out of graphite because it will literally cut through anything. It's actually how I first heard about the whole thing, because they have been joking about making such a sword for over 30 years, I think, with the hopes of making such a sword and then cutting through absolutely everything, because
But the thing is, that wouldn't work because it's only super hard in one dimension.
you just have to be very precise.
So you have to literally, any shear force at all is just going to shatter it.
That's why you have to be very precise.
You wouldn't want from carbon the edge to be made from that monomolecular word for it, blade. Basically, there's just a single molecule on the top of the blade, sliced through everything like butter.
Yeah.
So you'd still want a sword that's not completely made from graphite. I mean, I guess you could have it be some other carbon compound, but
Okay, I'm gonna make a rude transition here, which also kind of fits though, I would guess, because we're on the topic of technology, and the next question from me would be, in war, how do tactics and strategy evolve, and then which kind of overall categories can we recognize that influence these areas of warfare?
I see someone used priority speech there.
So, basically, in war, this is my 2 cents before, I'm gonna try to put this like before we start the whole thing. In war, everything can be used, and I mean absolutely everything. And as an example, I'm going to give like, it sounds a bit irrelevant, but bear with me. So, I've been playing like online games for many years now, and one of the first ones I properly played was Ark Survival Evolved. Now, in that game, there was a lot of PvP, and so people had to be pushed to make some very weird inventions in order to stay on top, because you only had a limited tech tree for the game. And one of the first things you learned about that is that anything in that game that could be used, and like we can very much treat this game as the set of mechanics and tech that people can use in war. Everything that could have been used was used. You could build like you could have pets, and then on these pets build like a little building. So people built a walking cage that cannot be shot at because it's surrounded by metal. So you would have to explode the metal first. So then you could literally just run into somebody's base with that. And that was the start of these shenanigans.
So basically a tank.
Yeah, and more bizarre things were created. I was one of the first people that recognized like that basically people had a strategy where you had a turtle that could soak up a lot of bullets from turrets, and then he had a spot on him that the turrets couldn't actually shoot him. And you had a C4 charge in that game, so people would put a lot of C4 charges on turtles on that spot, and then soak up bullets and explode them. So then you get a bomb that also soaks a lot of bullets from other nearby turrets. And that was one thing. I was one of the people that took this strategy a bit further, because you had a bird that could barrel roll. So we put C4 charges on this bird. And the one fun thing about this barrel roll is that it would barrel roll from outside turret range into a wall. Directly. You couldn't intercept it. So you would have rockets with that could not be intercepted. And it's even more bizarre. Like, we would abuse bunny hopping and C4 charges and stuff that does that. There was even an experimental one we tried at some point, we wanted to try rather, where you had a creature that was very, very large, and you could put something, like a bronto basically, and you could put something on its tail, like you'd put a C4 there, and then if it would swing its tail, then that would go really far and through walls because they were lazy about collision. So you could basically explode a base from inside while standing in a safe spot. And basically what I'm getting at is everything can and will be used in war. Because when you need an edge, the most bizarre underhanded tactics are going to be used, including attaching termites to bats, which was attempted and almost succeeded even. In the real world, by the way.
It was at least a bit more successful than the Japanese counterpart of sending thermite blimps over with the Pacific Current. They just filled up balloons, filled them with thermite, and sent them on their way. One U.S. citizen actually died from it on U.S. soil. He was curious, walked up to it, and then that's when it detonated, I think.
Wow.
That's bad luck.
Yeah, that's a whole nother level of bad luck. I think Carbon wanted to say something as well.
Yeah, with the everything that can be used will be used thing, there is one little issue with that, which is that people have morals. After World War I, even the Nazis didn't use chemical weapons, and except for gassing the Jews. That was chemical weapons, but they didn't use them in the battlefield. There are morals.
But the morals took World War I to develop. Which is my point.
To play devil's advocate, and I'm not saying that's the only reason, but Germany learned, all sides learned that chemical weapons will actually usually hit your own troops as well, especially if you're focusing. The wind. Yeah, if you're using mustard gas and the wind just turns and you're just looking at this death cloud that you just sent out, and you're just like, well,
that's karma.
Yeah, so you can argue that's why they didn't use it. You can also argue that even Nazis had morals.
Probably a combination of both.
certainly some people still had morals, but yeah. That said, that at least there is room for morals in war. There are also wars that are fought without them.
Morals take time to develop. And again, I would argue that we can take this example even further. Like World War One, yeah, they didn't have morals. Like anyone with any common sense back then would have told you, yeah, mustard gas is probably the most horrible thing we can put on the enemy soldiers. And then a general would usually follow it up with, and that's why it's so good. Because they did develop morals after that. I would argue that they didn't have them earlier, and yeah, and even then, a lot of countries after that would still use it. I mean, you still have allegations of modern countries using chemical weapons on each other, on their own citizens. Yeah, it's morals are a thing, but they're not subjective.
You find that the more compassionate and more equal a society becomes, so when you have equality and compassion, morals also develop beside that.
Does sound that does make sense, yeah. But it is basically especially if a world hasn't had any horrible wars yet, the aversion to using some of the more horrible stuff would be only really limited by how much do they hate their enemies and want them to suffer before their death.
And also something that's interesting to note is that you tend to have one major war each century, at least up until World War II. And World War I and II, you had two in that century. But you tend to have one major war per century, which seems to be because all of the people who remembered the last one forgot about it. Well, were dead, rather.
So
I think it's more that they died, yeah.
Yeah. But all the people who were there died, and so then they have another war. But it's always about once per century.
Maybe.
You also get the same thing with plagues, and people argue about both, that it's because people forgot how to deal with them, so then you get the perfect ground for one.
There is certainly truth to that, but I'm not sure how set in stone that is. We are, at least most of Europe is almost 10 more years than we are 100 years free of war. So something's happening. Also, the whole way how conflicts are happening, I kind of alluded to that earlier, is also changing, at least in industrial societies.
So we're all basically too bourgeois to go to war now? Is that what we're saying?
I mean, maybe if you want to put that into a negative light, sure.
I'm just being facetious.
I mean, when you look at empires that become mature, they focus less on external conquest and more on internal stability. And as they grow wealthier, you have increased corruption and all those sorts of problems, and they eventually collapse to an external threat, right? And so, near the end of the Roman Empire, there was portions of peace, and then eventually it all went to crap, right? And it could be that the world is just in that kind of a situation where after World War II, you had two major powers that they were so big that nobody dared really have any major wars. So there was a long period of peace as both of them kind of looked to, little skirmishes here and there. And then it was more of an internal thing. And now that one of them is gone, you have the same kind of peace again, because there's no real big threat. So, arguably China now, right? And so it could be that we're just waiting for the, America to collapse and for somebody to take its place and really throw a wrench into the world's peaceful order as it is right now.
Here's the thing about China, from my perspective at least. When I look at China, I like the People's Republic of China. It kind of looks to me like Germany before World War One, basically, because they have supply lines that they can't adequately secure themselves, and they are stepping on everyone's toes who borders them. I think they have like 17 border conflicts. What do you guys think about it?
Well, yeah, they are.
Oh, well,
They are also trying to exert kind of a dominance within their local region.
Oh, and build a blue water navy. Like a large.
yeah. And you started it. China is definitely the aggressor in those border conflicts. They want those conflicts. With China, when I look at them, I see an evolution of a non-democratic society that is oppressive to the other people thinking differently. Right? You have, and of course, this is difficult to say for certain. China is very good about controlling what goes in, what comes out. But when you hear interviews about normal Chinese people, them getting asked what do they think about, well, the censorship and that they are meant to think a certain way, they often answer, I know it. I know that the state wants to control what I think, but honestly, I live a good life. I'm happy as long as I am a good citizen. I will be happy. And the state certainly has its troubles, but it's an evolution from what we've seen before in the past. And that is pretty scary to me because they play modern warfare where they are economically involved everywhere, to the extent that US is starting to look kind of old next to them when it comes to economic intermingling in other countries. And it's pretty scary that the US, as much as you might want to complain about them, it's still a mostly free country. So mostly a good thing for Europe, where I live. China, yeah. I don't.
Mixed feelings.
I mean, if I had to identify anyone as the highest threat to just global peace, or then, yeah, probably either China or whatever the fuck is going on over at our Western neighbor's place. Like over the ocean.
I will say about China, though, and this is like, I think this is one of the more unprecedented things, because, like, unlike a lot of previous, like, societies that you could kind of compare to China, in China you have a very weird distinction between, like, the ruling class and the actual civilians. The ruling class are almost playing these power games around the world. The civilians, frankly, not only do they not really care about them, in fact, a lot of them are kind of opposed to it because they just want to be nice to people around them. A lot of them are fairly nice people. So I don't think they can actually even properly handle a proper conflict, even from inside, as much as they just play around with it, like with the possibility, because it's very lucrative to actually play around with such a thing.
Calm, what's your take on it? I think Australia's probably a bit closer than most of us here.
Well, yeah, I don't think China would actually want a war on the grounds. Well, at the moment, they wouldn't really want a war on the grounds that a lot of their resources come from other countries because they can't actually feed themselves. Not on their own. They can't actually feed themselves. And we're well aware of that in Australia.
We feed China.
I mean, Australia does a lot as well. Yeah, Australia and America basically feed China.
Yeah, we.
That's
Yeah,
what
you and I.
That's what I meant with economic warfare. China is obviously aware of them not being independent. They do need to trade regards, so they find ways to use the global trading system we have set up, and in some regards, perfectly legally, just participating like everybody else. That's just again not they're not really doing anything illegal, but like it's clear what they are doing. They're buying influence.
I mean, they're also doing plenty of stuff that is illegal even under
Well,
international law. So.
I mean,
However, they do impose sanctions a lot. They do impose economic sanctions a lot, like even more than the US does.
yeah, and that is also part of economic warfare. They are good at it because that's the modern way to really get your ideology and your power up there. A war is costly, and it's really bad PR. Like it really is.
So
Really is.
I guess to bring it a bit back to the initial question I started with about tactics and strategy, how important would you say are logistics, and like when are they more important and are they less important? And
I would
how
argue
much-
that logistics lost World War II for the Germans.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah, I mean,
I mean, none of us is a general, but I don't know if it was yesterday, but
I'm an armchair general, so
yeah. I don't know if it was yesterday or the day before, but I was actually listening to something that was going kind of that route, and logistics determine the winning side. Like, yeah, you need military, of course, but if you cannot support the troops, then that's when the war ends. There are just enough. There are like look at the early 20th century and 19th century wars. There are enough bodies to throw in the fight, but there are not enough swords. There's not enough food. There's not enough medicine. Like the First World War wasn't. Well, the First World War, you could argue it could have. Both sides just kept throwing men in there. Like that wasn't the issue.
I think an easier example is to go back to medieval times, when many fiefs or dukedoms often only had a dozen knights, a dozen trained knights. That's it. That's all they had, because that's all they could afford. They could only afford the armor and the weaponry and the training for a dozen knights. And those were the ones who did well. The ones who went, okay, I'm just going to get 1 billion infantry and see what happens. They didn't do so well because they didn't understand the logistics. They didn't understand that a few good soldiers are a lot better than a whole bunch of cannon fodder.
I mean, wasn't
You also have the story of a castle in Portugal that was being besieged, and the city had run out of food, so the lady who was in charge of it went and took the rest of their bread, threw it over the castle wall, and basically told I think it was the Spaniards who were attacking, and said, "Hey, we've got plenty of food. It looks like you're starving though, so you can have some of ours." And the Spaniards were like, "Oh crap, we're running out of food, and they've got so much. Well, siege is pointless." They packed up and left. So, I mean, logistics back then were the make or break for a siege. It was oftentimes who could outlast the other, with foods and supplies.
And sieges are much the same as any other war of attrition.
Right.
I think a good rule of thumb for all of this is basically like, if both sides are like in supposedly ideal, well, define ideal, but like because ideal wouldn't have war. But like in a supposedly ideal world where both sides are logistically perfect, it comes down to strategy and tactics and everything. But logistics are almost like a modifier for this whole thing. Like, if your logistics are terrible, then like you might be operating at 50% efficiency, even 25%, even 10% at times. So like, sure, you can compare plans like you can compare plans in terms of like if executed perfectly, which plan will win. But usually it won't be executed perfectly, and I think like that's probably why, for example, like the more famous strategy games are usually not the extremely complicated like strategy ones, but like proper RTSs, but rather stuff like XCOM, where you will fail by definition because your logistics will not be perfect, and where it's controlled by RNG and not by you, but still your logistics will not be perfect. So it's not about making a perfect strategy; it's about working with what you have, and like basically like logistics like are a modifier to everything else. And so even if you have the best tactic, if you do not have the means of carrying it out, it is not necessarily pointless, but it is a lot worse.
Yeah, I remember now where I picked up the what I listened to. It was about the Iraq War, and it was an interview with a U.S. general that basically said the biggest mistake that the Iraqi military did is hit the U.S. in an open, direct conflict instead of going asymmetric warfare, because they did neither have the military nor the logistics to support a classic fight. And yeah, like it just shows you exactly what you just said. Like in a war, it's about how you utilize your existing resources to the most efficiency.
Yeah, to kind of summarize the logistics point then, as far as I would see it, is that logistics determine how far you can reach and how effectively you can employ what you have. Does that sound about right?
Oh yeah.
Yeah,
Like,
absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
like look at the U.S. The military is extremely well organized, and at least from an outside looking view, and a lot of attention to detail is put to the supply chains. Like carrier groups have a continuous line of supply, and the carriers themselves, they carry reserves. The carriers, the super carriers, are much less a military tool, and as they are a mobile base.
It is notable, though, that they do have virtually infinite funding.
Well, yeah, that is that is definitely so.
Much
But
to the
they are
dismay
also-
of their infrastructure.
It just comes with being really good at war, that the US knows how important logistics is. You can see how much attention to detail is put into that sort of thing. Like Germany's contribution to the Navy, besides our 48,000 minesweeper boats that we have for whatever reason, well, we know why, but it's like 3/4 of our Navy ships. One of the main contributions, besides the couple of frigates we send in there every now and then, and the submarines, which are still pretty damn good, German submarines still good, is supply chain. We have a bunch of really big military cargo vessels.
Well, if they work.
Well, yeah.
But let's not go in like on this
Negative example. That's a negative example of why logistics is important. Nobody thought.
Yeah.
Another good positive example is Australia. Australia never actually sends troops to fight. At least we don't in modern warfare. We were in Afghanistan, Iraq, etc. Australian troops only train troops that are already there. They don't directly engage in conflict. And even if there's an aggression from someone like China, Australia will never engage in conflict because the military here understands they just don't have the numbers. they could never win a direct fight with anyone. So they understand logistically that their best bet is to have alliances with other people to train other people's soldiers because they can, because they have a lot of funding for very few people.
Yeah, but wouldn't you lose some of your competences when you never fight in a war? Or
They
at
still
least in a
run a
combat?
lot of they still run a lot of training exercises with other nations as well.
Okay, but if you're not in a combat situation, I would beg the question whether you're like on top of the game, so to speak, as to what are the newest tactics and how to counter, for example, asymmetric warfare tactics.
That's fair. I wouldn't really know too much about that. I was just
Me
giving the
neither.
example of picking your battles is still a logistical thing as well.
True.
I would
yeah.
argue. I would argue that, like, specifically in the example of Australia, with the amount of shared drills they do with other countries and like simulations, I think Australia is like only behind the US in terms of like combat simulations, like investments in that industry. So, like, if I remember correctly, at least. So, like, yeah, technically they never fought a real war, but it's one of those things where, like, yes, you have like two people that like one of them has fought a war and won, but he was like a peasant infantry with a little stick, and the other one, sure, he never fought a war, but he has practiced countless times like with the best soldiers in the world, and yeah, technically one of them has combat experience, but I think we all know who we're betting on.
Yes and no. I would like to give the example of an American war game that they played through after the Iraq War, I think, and they basically put one of their generals in charge of the Iraqi army, and they had a bunch of people who like ran their simulations in the military, and basically what this older general did was he didn't even allow the US to land their troops by just overwhelming them with so many rockets that their defense systems wouldn't be able to cope with them. The ship's systems, that is. So, I don't know. I think you can simulate a lot of things, sure, but if you're actually on the ground, there are just some lessons that you can't learn otherwise, would be my guess at least.
I would actually take this example against you because that general, if he was in charge of the war in Iraq, like from the side where he was in the simulation, it would probably play out very similarly. In fact,
Yes, but this general had combat experience. That's what I'm getting at.
and yet, like, I would still argue that he also had simulation experience and he knew a lot more than the Iraqi general in there. Like, he knew that he could overwhelm the Americans. I would doubt that if the Iraqi even had a proper structural hierarchy back then, which, by the way, is a bit trickier in some of these wars than you would think.
They
but, like,
probably had it nominally at least.
yeah, but even if they had like a proper, super defined hierarchy, like what that general probably used, they didn't even know probably that they could just overwhelm the Americans and then they would never land. And like, yeah, obviously you learn a lot from both things, and all that. But I would still argue that simulations, like, first of all, it's a lot easier to train somebody to the max from the simulation side than from the real combat experience side. But again, like, you get a lot of, like, sure, there might be a few tiny differences, but still, again, it's like it goes back to the same point of if both sides are perfectly trained, then yeah, you might have like some differences, but honestly, you need both sides to be perfectly trained, and if you have one side that is overwhelmingly more prepared than the other, then even if they don't have proper combat experience, they will probably still win.
It's worth mentioning that simulation experience is still real experience. It's not like reading a book, because you can't become good at war by just reading a book. You do need experience rather than just theory. However, simulation experience is still experience. It's still practical experience.
Yes, I would just argue that it's not on the same level as someone is
Yeah,
literally shooting at you.
You don't quite have the adrenaline rush.
Yeah. So,
Yeah. It might not be perfectly that, but it is very close, and I would argue that it has some extra advantages. Like, for example, you can respawn. Like, a lot of these things are done in VR, and you can respawn. That's a huge
You can
advantage.
try again,
You
yeah.
learn how not to die, basically.
yeah. Yeah, it is way more economical. Of course, yeah. I'm not gonna argue against that point. So, I guess another question that would fall into kind of the same category of tactics and strategy would be how does the triumvirate of firepower, armor, and speed dictate tactics? And I guess tactics also dictates strategy to a certain point. What's your opinion on that?
So you're saying offensive capacity, defensive capacity, and motion and movement of troops.
Basically, yeah.
Okay. I'm going to let someone else start here.
Since we are talking about military, one of my favorite subjects, I guess I will start. Offensive capacity and defensive capacity, like, let's start with those two. They are fairly important, especially in our world. I would argue that in a fictional world, they will have less of a significance, but that also will depend, obviously, on the setup of your world. Because, for example, this is one of the things you see very quickly with, as soon as you start mixing in magic, a lot of times, where if your magic is strong enough, usually defensive capacity will be almost non-existent compared to the offensive capacity of it. I would argue that magic basically exemplifies the idea of, like, the best defense is offense because they can't attack you if they're dead. The second less known half of that phrase. So yeah, you basically, like, they do affect a lot of things. Obviously, like, if you have a lot of defensive capacity but not a lot of offensive capacity, fights will obviously look very different. Absolutely, because, like, if I have a certain amount of like, if I can, for example, I have X amount of bombs that do a Y amount of damage per bomb. That is nice if it's compared to itself, but if it's compared to somebody that has twice these bombs and each of his bombs do twice the damage, then suddenly I look very weak and without a lot of offensive power. But if I'm against somebody who's literally just using sticks, then even if I have one bomb that does almost no damage, it's still more than a stick. And if it isn't, then I can just hit him with it, and it's the same idea. So, like, first of all, these things are relative, but on top of that, like, especially when we're talking about military and world building, I would argue that it's a lot, like, it's very, very related, like, it's very, very relevant, like, how your world is structured and what technologies you have in there. And, like, to go back to the example I gave earlier from Oxford Evolved, it's not just what you use specifically for military. It's what you have in that world, because almost everything can be used for military if you're brave enough. It's just a question of how good it is, and as such, everything in your territory should be considered. Everything in your territory, everything that you have available, every bizarre creature that you can use, like, maybe you will use elephants, and maybe then the enemy will realize that they can just use horns and scare the elephants back to you. And then suddenly elephants do not sound like such a good idea. But
and even healing magic in a universe. So hear me out here.
Crazy.
So I'm just latching onto that using everything thing.
Yeah.
So healing magic in universe, if you could scan a person with healing magic and you can heal anything, imagine if you gave more energy to some cancer cells that you found. and you just gave them violent cancer, and you literally healed them to death until they exploded in a big ball of cancer.
Yeah, and like taking that point like to an even more demented dimension, like torture is a very important part. Like, first of all, if you can demoralize the enemies, oh wow, what you can do to them. And like, if you have superior healing magic, imagine the possibilities. You can torture the enemy in order to get information out of them, because suddenly you don't have to worry about actually survive this. Yeah, no, they'll survive. Worst case, we'll just stitch them back up. And you can broadcast that live. And furthermore, what if you get an enemy unit and you trap them? You can now heal them and harm them and heal them and harm them until you completely and utterly break them. The possibilities are only really limited by how demented you are and how much you hate your enemy, because honestly, it feels less and less demented the more you hate your enemy. And yeah, like, you can do some crazy things with that. Like, the trifecta of offense, defense, and I forgot the third one. A little bit,
basically.
Yeah, like, so this trifecta is especially prominent in our world, but I would argue that it expands when you add any fantasy element, and even if you don't add fantasy elements, our world would have gone very, very, very differently if we didn't have a few inventions, or if we had different inventions. Even if we just switched up a little bit the order of things. Because remember, a lot of times we don't use the most optimal thing. We use something that has been the most optimal when it was adapted. Oh, hopefully. And then usually, like, far more optimal than we'll use it. But if switching to it is too costly, we might not even bother. So it's not just a matter of, like, what do we have, it's also a matter of when do we have it.
Yeah, I guess.
Hooray, we just somehow managed to circle back to logistics.
Kind of
So
true.
I have a question. What is in the modern world even a defensive capability? So offensive capability. Like, I'm thinking, I guess, stationary military defenses. Like, nobody really builds bunkers outside of the command structure anymore.
In the modern world,
I mean,
defense
trenches.
usually is artillery. Like, that's your biggest defense and biggest offense usually. Like, I don't think a lot of wars lately, especially military conflicts, have actually been fought with infantry versus infantry, or even land troops versus land troops. Like, land troops is usually something that a far stronger side will use on a weaker side to get them to behave. But usually, conflict, especially when there's a power disparity between the sides, will be mainly artillery. Because, like, I'm gonna take a very controversial example, which is I live in that example. Basically, like, one of the weirder things I think about our situation, especially, it's really weird when you play like RTS games and then you get introduced to that, and it completely changes your perspective on strategy. Because in our weird old country, we're not fighting against actual rockets. We don't do that. Like, basically, we have to create extremely sophisticated rockets or missiles or whatever you want to call them to intercept, for lack of a better word, flying pipes. And I kid you not, you literally, like, it was a whole point of debate about supplying, like, the Gaza Strip, because when you supply them, a lot of the supplies end up in Hamas's hands. And it was a whole debate on supplying them with traffic signs, because they would then just take these traffic signs, take the pole, it's a very sturdy iron pole, and then you attach a few tiny flaps to it, fill it with gunpowder, and this is now a missile. And to counter that, or rocket, or whatever you want to call it, and now to counter that, you would need extremely sophisticated rockets that intercept this thing mid-air. Defensive capability is, like, having a barracks near the border does jack shit in such a situation. You need, like, these missiles are extremely expensive. And yeah, defensive is a lot of budget tunnels below the border, because they can't get over the border, we've established that. so they try to get below it. And so suddenly, your solution to people with shovels, and yeah, it's literally shovels usually. Your solution to people with shovels is to create the most the weirdest, most complicated radar systems that then they just dig deeper. And then you have to make your systems deeper. And defensive capabilities are bizarre in the modern world, especially when you're fighting guerrilla warfare, which, again, there's not a lot of proper, proper conflicts in the world today in terms of, military. It's usually guerrilla warfare.
Yeah.
Against groups that are far weaker than a nation.
Yeah, that's kind of why I asked the question. Defensive capabilities, and you stay strictly in the real world. Obviously, magic kind of throws the whole thing out of the water. Defensive capabilities is much less about actual military assets and much more about strategy, intel, and knowing where the enemy is. I find that a bit because I'm trying to work up a story that's as close as I can do it to hard science, but I want a little bit of fiction in there. So I'm thinking a lot about that stuff, because I'm also, to just develop the story a little bit, I find myself not having much time to write the story itself, but I do find myself every now and then to actually play a pen and paper setting within that universe. So I need to kind of balance it, right? You can't play, or you can, but with most rule sets, it's usually you need some defensive capability to have a fun engagement in a fight in a role-playing setting. So I find myself questioning a lot of offensive capability is when you're really blunt about it, you can just always drop a nuke, right? And then when you go into the future, it only gets worse. Energy shielding is kind of a very it's I have some kind of plasma shield, but it has extreme drawbacks and just eats a lot of power and yada yada. So it's interesting to see what other kind of defensive capabilities you have that work with physics and work with the whole, as we already said before, logistics. You can't, if your enemy is throwing $3 pipes at you and you're killing those pipes with $200,000 missiles, then the enemy kind of not kind of winning, but
Yeah.
definitely a problem.
It's basically it's a fairly old paradox with this. I wouldn't necessarily call it a paradox, but basically it's a conundrum with military where defense scales horribly with technology, more so when you consider the fact that defense has to be on all of your area, while offense only has to target a tiny point. And the more precise we get with offense, the harder that gets, because then basically you need to defend a whole area, and the offense just needs to pick the tiniest hole in your defense, and they can cause a lot of damage. And basically, I think if you would basically create curves of offense versus defense, so when cavemen started, they had offense, and then soon after they had a bit of defense. So they had offense as in basic tools that can stab things, and then defense when they started learning how to create basic armors and even shields. And then with shields you kind of reach shields and basic armor, you reach somewhat of an equilibrium. Not really, but it's probably the closest offense and defense have ever been throughout history. Because as soon as you create artillery, even the most basic artillery, you have no defense against that for ages. And then we still, by the way, don't actually know how to defend against a catapult. It's just highly ineffective today. But we don't actually have a way to defend against that. And so if you would look at it, often scales like almost exponentially, like offensive capabilities, because you can just add more power to it, or you can just shoot more rockets. Defense, on the other hand, scales extremely poorly, and this is actually one thing that I think would be very interesting if somebody manages to do properly in a magical setting. Well, and by the way, I think the only way to properly do that is probably with arbitrary balancing, or like, if masked properly, basically magic that is borrowed from certain entities that have very specific rules about that don't necessarily follow physics as much as it's just they're enabling you to use that magic. You can only use it in certain ways. I think that's the only way to even make defensive capabilities remotely close to offensive. Today, even today, what is the United States' defensive capabilities? Not much. The defensive capabilities are, we have nukes. They don't actually have a lot of ways to intercept a missile. I mean, they buy stuff from us.
I would argue the nukes are also offensive capabilities instead of defensive.
Yeah, but that's the closest they have to a defensive capability. They buy the technology for all the stuff that we use to intercept missiles. That's actually one of the people often are kind of baffled about the whole U.S. Israel alliance thing here. We develop a lot of tech for that. A lot of tech. It's that's our entire purpose. But yeah, so they buy all the stuff that we use and test for intercepting missiles, and a lot of countries in the world actually do that. But the United States doesn't actually have a lot of defensive. So many offensive. That goes for most countries. Nobody really has a lot of defensive capabilities. We have the most, still not much. Our offense to defense is we have a lot of defense, quite a bit of offense, I would argue. That's it. And most other countries have a lot more offense than anything else, because offense is so much more effective, and also you can with these you have to put in so much more work for such a tiny chunk. Well, with offense. By the way, there is hypothetically, supposedly a way where defense might scale again. And this is something that is currently in testing in Israel. And it might even be combat ready, I think, 2025, I think, was the deadline. Well, basically, it's the whole idea of using lasers to intercept missiles. Because with that, if you can already detect a missile and aim at it, you don't have to defend your entire area, because you have because this is a very precise thing that you just aim. And well, power is a lot cheaper than $1 million missile or something. If I remember correctly, every compatible Zell missile is around $1 million. But with lasers, you can intercept stuff fairly quickly. But even then, that only works in missiles. You can't intercept people. Or you can. I don't think it's gonna pass well in the international field. But yeah.
So to summarize this a tiny bit, I guess we could say that defensive capabilities usually have to be more sophisticated than offensive capabilities.
Yeah, and not only do they have to be more sophisticated, usually you will not find defensive capabilities in the military tech tree. Our defensive capabilities, these missiles that intercept things, are the only thing remotely military that we have as a defensive capability. For example, for the tunnels, we use radar technology that is not even proper radar. It's optic fibers that detect vibrations in the ground. That's the stuff we use for that. This is stuff that's used for communications. We don't have it perfectly work. This is the direction that this field is currently heading in.
I mean, defensive capabilities would also probably, tanks would, and their armor would fall into the defensive capability, or
but they are not a defense mechanism in a strategic sense. That's just part of the system.
Yeah.
And even then, it doesn't scale nearly as well. Imagine how cheap, how cheap it is to just pierce tank armor. Yeah, sure, it's a bit complicated, but it's one missile versus one tank.
Yeah, the whole tanks are still one example where like physical defense is still visible clearly and still developed actively. Reactive armor is quite effective, but there are already projectiles that specifically counter reactive armor, and there is reactive armor specifically designed to counter missile weapons that counter reactive armor. So it's a cat and mouse game, because to kill a tank, you just need to punch any vital system, and it's either the turret doesn't work anymore, and then it's effectively just a moving doorstop, or you take out the motor, and then it's a stationary turret that you can avoid, and you just need to punch a hole into it. You have a lot of options, but you only have one option to defend, or multi-layer solutions exist, but they add weight, they add price, complexity, everything. You'll find that the reactive armor is only usually in very specific areas because it's expensive, and it is also dangerous. It is an explosive. It's just not practical to put that on ships. Also, the way damage scales, there isn't really any armor that protects a ship. Like the defense for a ship is just not being seen.
Like, it's basically, think how long it takes to develop defensive technology and make sure that it is safe and everything. And then what happened as soon as we had Versailles in widespread use? They started sending burning kites. I shit you not. Burning kites. What do you do against burning kites? You cry, because they burn your fields, and there's absolutely nothing you can do about it. What are you going to do about a bunch of balloons with something burning attached to them? You have nothing against that. Imagine how, it took... attached... It's just... you take years to develop defensive capabilities, where usually you also have to have something already offensive that you're trying to develop against actively, and then it takes one guy and you're out. It's just it's not just that defense scales in terms of capability poorly. It's also in terms of research and in terms of costs and in terms of how easy.
Okay, so there's one last statement I want to make and see what you guys think about it, and then I would start wrapping it up. And my statement would be that on a strategic level, the speed of the front line, I would say, how it moves is determined by the offensive capabilities on both sides, and then you can, I guess, subtract some of the offensive capabilities of the other side by employing your own defensive mechanisms. What do you guys think about that? So, to give some more clarification, I would say in the First World War, offensive capabilities on both sides were about equal, and none of them had huge defensive mechanisms that would subtract any of their of the others' offensive ones, until they came up with tanks, for example. And then the trench warfare moved back to a more mobile warfare. So what do you think about that? Is that a good assessment on my part, or?
I don't know the assessment because at least on my side you cut off for half of it, but from what I did hear, I would say basically the tip I would leave anyone trying to design a proper fight between two nations, or even two intergalactic empires or whatever, is at the end of the day, you have to think when you're planning how the battle will even go. If you have a goal, that's nice and all, but usually the way you will end up going about it, at least that I find to be most effective is just you look at everything they have on all fields, because everything is relevant to war. And you think, what did they start with? And for all the weird interactions and integrations and whatever that they might have, you can roll dice for when they figure them out. But basically, capabilities are a lot more intricate than just how many tanks somebody has or how many battleships they have. Capabilities on defense, on offense, and everything goes to shape how the war is fought, including also that you will usually not be fighting in the most ideal way, because obviously generals are never perfect.
Carbon, what's your take on that?
I mean, I was just thinking about referencing Space Invaders and saying that it's not a very good analog for actual speed in warfare.
Okay. Daniel, did you get all of what I?
So the question was how troop movement is affected, or
I guess
what is the driving factor?
Yeah, I guess what the speed of advancement of any force is, like how fast they can get into enemy territory.
It of course depends heavily on the resources available. Like, many nations don't have the capability of deploying cross the oceans. Like, NATO has that capability mostly of the US. The French and the British obviously have a couple carriers. They're tremendously important for that sort of thing. But I would say that intelligence is incredibly important. It's probably the biggest factor in defensive capabilities that you have today. It's not a shield. It's an eye, and the eye is in the sky, right? So satellites and networking. So if you know where the enemy, so be it a state or be it a terrorist group, when you know where an enemy is, you know how to proceed. You will usually don't see anyone moving where
intelligence is
is
important. Intelligence is important because it is probably one of the only ways defense can somewhat scale. If the enemy is organized enough and you know how they organize, then you don't have to defend everything, but you only have to defend the things that they risk. Which, is it makes defense somewhat viable, still not good. It's better.
Okay, I guess I'm gonna wrap it up with saying that surprise is also an element of warfare, and then I think Carbon would like to give us a preview for the upcoming short story session, right?
Yeah, I was going to read out the beginning of the short story that the beginning that I wrote for the Ager Somniorum short story planning session, just kind of as a teaser trailer for the kind of thing we might be working on Saturday, but also there'll hopefully be some Barshan Wars short stories as well.
Mm-hmm.
So I will share my screen so that if I cut out, people can still also keep reading it.
It's still loading for me. Okay, here it is.
Intro.
I will start reading.
Mm-hmm. Take it away.
The ruination of eternal warfare dominated the landscape, if it could even be called that anymore. The light of the moon was barely visible as a dim, pearlescent pattern through the clouds in the eastern sky. The clouds that had shrouded the sky since it all ended. Every comfort, every kindness, everything worth living for. The clouds rained ash at all hours, day and night, although the two were nearly indistinct. The air all around was tinted red by the liquid vapor that rose from the rivers. Not blood, but it might as well have been. The rivers of liquid sulfur that sprung from the mountains they'd rent open, and the cracks they'd lanced through the earth's surface often burned a pale blue, a rare light in the world of darkness. A light that came alongside a smell like rotting flesh. Yet there was no flesh left to rot, only bones. This was the world in which he battled the last beast of the enemy's hordes, and in which that beast fought the last of his own enemy's legions. 2 beasts alone at the end of the world, clashing over who would remain in his personal damnation. David's nemesis approached, armor indistinguishable from his own, longsword raised high to cleave him through once and no more. This was his chance to commit the final crime, just as it was his enemy's. David raised his own blade just as his adversaries began to fall. A single blow of the base of his blade against the tip of his last task had the man stumbling forward, sword missing its mark as David's found its place in the throat of his final company. The second last of David's kind, his only kin, fell to the ground, churning up an opaque cloud of ash and dust that cleared to reveal the newly crowned king of a forsaken eternity, brought to his knees by the grief of his last terrible act. "We do only what we must," Tung's initiator told him as they watched the dream that had been forced upon the heretic David. "Now go, do as we discussed. He feels alone. Assure him that he is amongst those who love him, who will save him from the deceptions of his own mind." Tung nodded, although the dream forced upon David had left him almost numb. Tung stepped through into the crystal that housed David's personal dreamscape within Ager Somniorum. The paradoxical plane of a billion dreams gave way to the apocalyptic wasteland of just one. Tung knelt down beside David. Reduce yourself to his level, his initiator had taught him. "David, this isn't real, David. You're not alone." It took all of Tung's concentration to keep his voice steady. "You haven't hurt anyone. It's not real." David was shaking as he turned his head to face Tung. Not real? You're sure? You're real?" He stammered, disbelieving. Tung hesitated. Yes, I'm real," he confirmed after a few moments. "Let me take you back to the real world." David's sword, which had been supporting him, fell from his hands, and he clutched onto Tung's shoulders instead. "Yes, please, take me back. It must be better than this," he virtually begged. "Good, Ewan, good," Tung's initiator spoke into his mind. "Now bring him." Tung hesitated again. He knew what he was supposed to do, but he couldn't help wondering whether it was truly right, whether this was truly David's salvation or it was actually the same purgatory they'd already tormented him with. "Do it," Tung's initiator insisted. And so I will stop the screen share now.
That was a teaser, I will say.
That was what?
A relatively long teaser.
Yeah, well, it's the start of a short story.
Oh, I just had my mic muted. You know, I have goosebumps now, so... Really interesting. Okay. And with that, I hope...
I'm probably too tired to focus on short stories right now, so you will not get a very fancy reaction of me right now.
Oh,
Yeah, but that's just the thing to say. That's the kind of thing we'll be focusing on Saturday. So that was the lead into the Ager Somniorum story that was about a cult that's using the Land of Dreams to basically try to brainwash people.
All right. And with that, I hope that everyone who's in here will be there for Saturday, right?
Yeah, Saturday.
Yeah, would be awesome. And if for some reason some random viewer watched through like probably over an hour and a half of us rambling about war, and you would want to join
Which
in.
never changes.
Sorry?
Rambling about war, which never changes. Sorry.
Exactly. If you would like to join us or listen in or whatever, there's a Discord link in the description to this video, and please leave a like or subscribe or do whatever you usually do on YouTube to stay up to date. And
Unless just liking and reporting, in which case do not do it on YouTube, please.
yeah. And we'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.